Okay, this is week 6 of MGT6154.E1 Project Delivery Applications. So this week's topics are project governance, change management, and controls. And we're going to focus on how project governance and control planning help prepare the project for execution. And so far, the course project has developed core planning artifacts such as the scope, schedule, and budget. And this week, we're going to add the control layer that helps those earlier plans become more governable and usable as project conditions change. And we'll focus on project change management, governance, oversight functions, and control artifacts that support disciplined delivery. And we'll connect this week to the course project step 5, and where we can translate this into manageable artifacts. And we'll talk about that through this presentation. This week's presentation explains how governance and project controls prepare a project for disciplined execution. So we focus on the planning elements that help the project become more governable and execution ready. And we'll begin by placing week 6 in the larger context of the course project lifecycle, so it's clear how this week builds on scope, schedule, and budget work that we've completed earlier. And from there, we'll examine governance and oversight functions, followed by the role of project controls in making governance practical from a project level. And we'll look more closely at the 4 major control areas emphasized in the assignment, communications, quality, risk, and change planning. And then we'll clarify how issues, risk, and changes relate to one another, and why clear decision paths matter when projects begin facing real execution pressures. And we'll also discuss how governance and control methods should be tailored across predictive and adaptive and hybrid environments. And then finally, we'll connect directly to the course project, and we'll do a little looking ahead to week 7 and how week 7 involves finalizing the project planning. Why project controls matter before execution begins. Project controls guide performance, change, and decision-making during execution. Before a project moves fully into execution, it needs more than scope, schedule, and budget planning. It also needs a control structure. Project controls provide that structure by helping the team monitor performance, communicate appropriately, manage uncertainty, and respond to change in a disciplined way. This is important because execution creates pressure. Once the work is underway, issues emerge, risks develop, stakeholders request adjustments, and decisions often need to be made very quickly. If the project doesn't already have a control mechanism in place, the team and the project manager are forced to react without a clear framework. And that usually leads to inconsistency, confusion, and weak decision-making. Project controls help prevent that. They provide the practical means for governance to operate at the project level. In other words, governance defines who has the authority, what oversight's needed, and how project decisions should be made. While the project controls provide the plans, processes, and artifacts that make those expectations usable in a day-to-day project environment. For this week, the most important idea is that communications planning, quality planning, risk planning, and change planning are not just paperwork. Together, they form a meaningful control system that helps protect project performance and value delivery during execution. Week 6 defines the controls that support governance and discipline project adjustments. So by week 6, the project's already developed several planning foundations. By week 6, we've already developed these in our course project. We've identified the project, we've defined the scope, we've created schedule artifacts, we've developed a project budget. These earlier steps establish what the project is intended to do, and when the work should occur, and what resources and funding are expected to support delivery. Now we add another important layer. It brings the project into the control phase of planning by defining how the project will be governed, monitored, communicated, and adjusted as execution moves forward. In other words, this is the point where the project management plan becomes more operational. It's no longer just describing the intended work. It's about defining how work will be guided and protected once conditions begin to emerge. And that's why the week 6 deliverables focus on communications, quality, risk, and change management. These artifacts are not separate from earlier planning work, they extend it. They help ensure that the scope, schedule, and budget that we've already developed can be managed in a disciplined way under real project conditions. A useful way to think about this is that prior planning answered what the project is and how it is broadly organized. Now we want to answer how the project will stay aligned, visible, and governable as execution pressure emerges. Governance defines how project oversight, authority, and key decisions are structured. Project governance provides the structure that helps the project operate with accountability and direction. It defines how project oversight will occur, who holds decision-making authority, what kinds of decisions require review, and how the project stays aligned with organizational goals and expectations. This is important because projects don't operate in isolation. They exist within an organizational context that includes leadership, expectations, resource constraints, stakeholder interest, and risk tolerance. Governance helps connect those broader organizational realities into the project's actual management and decision-making process. At a practical level, governance helps answer the questions such as who can approve a significant change, when should an issue be escalated, what performance information should leadership review, how frequently should oversight occur, what level of control is appropriate for the project. And without clear answers to those questions, even a well-planned project can become inconsistent or difficult to manage. Governance is also not the same as micromanagement. Effective governance provides structure, decision clarity, and accountability without overwhelming the project with unnecessary approvals or bureaucracy. The goal is not to slow down the project work. The goal is to create the right level of oversight so the project can move forward with visibility and discipline. And so for this week's topic, governance is important because the control artifacts that we're developing will help translate governance expectations into guidance for the project. Project governance links organizational expectations to project level oversight and control. Project governance serves as the link between the organization and the project. At the organizational level, leaders are concerned with strategy, value, risk exposure, compliance, and resource use. At the project level, the team is focused on planning, coordination, execution, and day-to-day decisions. Governance helps connect those two levels so the project is not managed in isolation from other organizational priorities. This connection is important because projects are expected to contribute to larger business or situational or institutional goals. A project may be meeting internal milestones, but if it's drifting away from stakeholder expectations, strategic intent, or acceptable risk levels, it's no longer performing effectively from the organization's point of view. Governance helps prevent that disconnect. In practice, this means governance provides the structure for reporting, review, escalation, approvals, and accountability. Project controls make that structure usable. Communications plans define who needs that information. Quality plans clarify how standards will be protected. Risk plans help surface uncertainty, and change plans guide how adjustments are reviewed and approved. So governance is not separate from project controls. Governance establishes oversight logic, and project controls put that logic into day-to-day project management practice. This relationship is one of the most important ideas that we have this week. It's one of the main takeaways. Effective governance provides enough oversight to guide the project without slowing delivery, as we mentioned before. One of the most important ideas in governance is that more oversight isn't always better. A project can suffer from too little governance as well, but it can also suffer from too much. The challenge is defining the right level of control for the project's context. When governance is too weak, problems may not be surfaced early enough, reporting may be inconsistent, change decisions may be unclear, and risks may not receive appropriate attention. In that environment, the project can drift. Issues can escalate late, and leadership may lose confidence in the project's direction. So, on the other hand, when governance is too heavy, the project may become slow and overly bureaucratic. Teams may need too many approvals, reporting may consume excessive time, and routine decisions may be escalated unnecessarily. And in that case, governance stops helping performance and starts interfering with it. This is why governance needs to be tailored. A small, low-risk project doesn't need the same oversight structure as a large, strategic, or high-fit initiative. The right governance model depends on factors such as complexity, organizational visibility, stakeholder sensitivity, risk exposure, compliance needs, and consequences of failure. The goal here is not maximum control. The goal is appropriate control. Effective governance improves visibility, accountability, and decision quality while still allowing the project to move forward efficiently. So you want just enough governance to help the project, not enough so much that it causes a burden on the project. And it's a real balance. And again, it's a tailoring issue that project managers need to really master this for the projects they're working on to be successful. Governance must fit predictive, adaptive, and hybrid delivery. Governance should be tailored to the project's delivery approach as well. It's not a one-size-fits-all. The level and style of governance should reflect how the project is actually being delivered. Predictive, adaptive, and hybrid projects don't create, review, and adjust work in the same way. So they should not be governed exactly the same way either. In a predictive environment, governance often relies on formal planning, baseline control, schedule reviews, and clearer approval points, because more of the work is defined in advance. Oversight tends to focus on conformance to scope, schedule, budget, and approved change procedures. In an adaptive environment, governance still matters, but it usually takes on a different form. Oversight may occur through shorter feedback loops, iteration reviews, product level prioritization, frequent stakeholder engagement, faster decision cycles, and the focus is less on protecting a fixed plan and more on maintaining value, transparency, and disciplined adjustment over time. Hybrid environments, on the other hand, combine elements of both. In some parts of the project may require formal milestone oversight, while others may benefit from iterative learning and flexible adjustment. In those cases, governance needs to accommodate both structured controls and adaptive decision-making without creating contradictions. So as a project manager, you need to be able to accommodate both structured controls and adaptive decision-making. The important point here is that governance should support delivery rather than work against it. The project's oversight approach should fit how the work is planned, reviewed, and changed in practice. Project controls turn governance into practical management. Project controls make governance usable in the day-to-day project management. The controls are actually the tools that we're using, the tools and techniques that we use. Governance and project controls are closely related, but they're not the same thing. Governance defines the oversight structure. It clarifies who has authority, what must be reviewed, when escalation is needed, and how the project should remain aligned with organizational expectations. Project controls take those expectations and turn them into something usable in practice. And this is where the project moves from abstract oversight to operational management. A communication plan helps define who needs information and when it's needed and how it should be shared. A quality plan helps define how requirements and standards will be protected. A risk plan helps the team identify, assess, and respond to uncertainty. A change plan helps the project handle adjustment in a structured way. But without controls, the governance remains too broad to guide the project actively. So teams may know that oversight is required, but they may not know how to report, how to escalate, how to review quality concerns, or how to manage changes consistently. The controls provide that practical framework. A useful distinction is that government sets the rules for oversight, while project controls provide working mechanisms. And so that's why this week is important. We're at the point where the project planning becomes more actionable and governable and more ready for execution pressure. So we're in that transition period. Communications, quality, risk, and change plans work together to support project control. One of the most importance I have to emphasize this week is that the week 6 artifacts should not be viewed as isolated documents. They're connected parts of a broader control system that helps the project remain visible, disciplined, and governable during execution. So the communication plan supports control by establishing how information will move across the project. It helps define who needs updates, what information is important, how often reporting occurs, and how issues or decisions are escalated. Without that structure, control breaks down because the right people may not receive the right information at the right time. The quality plan supports control by clarifying how standards will be maintained, how deliverables will be reviewed, and how the project will determine whether work meets expectations. It helps prevent the project from drifting into rework, inconsistency, or acceptance problems. The risk plan supports control by identifying uncertainty before it becomes disruption. It helps the team think ahead about threats, opportunities, probability, impact, and response actions. That makes the project more prepared and more resilient. Change management plan supports control by defining how requested adjustments will be reviewed, evaluated, approved, and documented. This is especially important when scope, schedule, cost, or other baselines may be affected. Taken together, these plans do more than just satisfy assignment requirements. They create a practical operating framework for how the project will communicate, maintain standards, and respond to uncertainty and govern adjustment once execution's underway. So the same set of planning processes also aligns with the planning process group coverage in our text in the process group or practice guide, including quality management, plan communications management, plan risk management, identify risk, perform qualitative risk analysis, and perform quantitative risk analysis, and plan risk responses. So all those processes that we have, those control processes, help support this planning. Communications planning ensures project information reaches the right people at the right time. The communications plan is one of the most practical control artifacts in the project. It helps ensure that information doesn't move randomly or rely only on informal habits. Instead, it defines who needs information, what information matters, and how it will be delivered, and how often communications should occur. This is important because project control depends heavily on visibility. If stakeholders are not informed appropriately, decisions may be delayed, issues may not be escalated in time, and teams may begin operating with different assumptions. A project can appear to have a planning problem when the real issue is actually weak communication structure. So stakeholders need transparency. Communications planning also supports coordination. Different stakeholders need different types of information. Sponsors may need summary performance updates and exception reporting. Team members may need task level coordination and issue visibility. Functional managers may need resource or schedule information. The communication plan helps match the message format and the timing to the audience. It's also important to emphasize that communications planning is not only about routine updates. It also helps define escalation paths. When an issue, risk, or change request reaches a certain threshold, the project should already have a clear understanding of who needs to know and how quickly that communication should occur. And in that sense, communication planning supports more than information sharing. It supports transparency, coordination, responsiveness, and governance. It turns communication into a control mechanism rather than leaving it as an informal activity. And so this also aligns directly with the plan communications management as a distinct planning process in the PMI documentation. Quality planning defines how standards will be protected. Quality planning defines how the project will meet requirements and verify acceptable results. Quality planning is a control activity because it helps the project define in advance how acceptable performance and acceptable results will be determined. Rather than waiting until deliverables are finished and then discovering problems, the project establishes standards, review methods, and quality expectations early enough to guide the work as it's performed. This is important because quality problems often become schedule and cost problems very quickly. When standards are vague, when review methods are unclear, or when acceptance expectations are poorly defined, the project becomes more vulnerable to defects, rework, and stakeholder dissatisfaction, and delayed approvals. In that sense, the quality planning protects more than the deliverable itself. It also protects the project performance. The quality plan typically helps answer several practical questions. What standards or criteria apply to this project? How will the quality be assessed? What review activities, checkpoints, or tests will be used? Who is responsible for quality-related decisions? How the team will know what deliverables is acceptable? These questions help move quality more. formally from a general aspiration to a operational part of the project control. And it's also useful to distinguish quality planning from quality inspection alone. Effective quality management is not only about checking finished work, but also involves building quality into the way the project works so that problems are reduced earlier rather than corrected later. So we should understand that quality management is part of the project control structure. It helps define how standards will be maintained and how the project will verify that work products are acceptable before they create downstream problems. And this connects directly to the planned quality management in the PMI literature. But risk planning prepares the project to identify, assess, and respond to uncertainty in a structured way. Risk planning is one of the most important control activities because it helps the project deal with uncertainty before that uncertainty turns into performance problems. Rather than waiting for disruptions to occur and then reacting under pressure, the project team defines how risk will be identified, assessed, prioritized, and addressed in a more disciplined way. This matters because uncertainty affects nearly every aspect of project delivery. Risk can influence schedule, cost, quality, resource availability, stakeholder confidence, and even the feasibility of key deliverables. Without a defined risk planning approach, teams may notice threats only after they begin affecting outcomes, which usually reduces the range of effective response options. A strong risk planning approach helps answer several practical questions. How will risk be identified? How will the team evaluate the probability and impact of the risk? When is qualitative analysis enough, and when might quantitative analysis be useful? Response strategies will be used, and who will own those responses? And how will risk be monitored as the project moves forward? These are planning questions, but they directly affect execution readiness. It's also important to emphasize that risk planning is not only about creating a list of threats, it's about creating a management approach. The plan helps establish methods, criteria, roles, response expectations, and review rhythms so that uncertainty can be managed consistently rather than informally. This week's assignment artifact is part of the project overall control system, and it helps the project become more prepared, more deliberate, and more resilient when conditions begin to change. Change management defines how proposed changes will be reviewed, approved, and controlled. Change management is a normal part of project work. Stakeholder needs evolve and risk materialize, assumptions shift, and new information becomes available as the project moves forward. The problem is not that change occurs. The problem is that when change occurs without a defined method for evaluating and governance. That's why change management is an important control activity. It helps the project establish how proposed changes will be submitted, reviewed, analyzed, approved, or rejected, documented, and communicated. In other words, it provides the structure needed to treat change as a managed decision rather than an informal reaction. This is especially important because change rarely affects only one part of the project. A requested scope adjustment may also affect the schedule, the cost, the quality expectations, resources, stakeholder commitments, and the project's risk exposure. Without a defined change process, those impacts may not be assessed clearly before actions taken. So a strong change management plan helps answer practical questions such as what qualifies as a change request? Who has authority to review and approve different types of changes? What analysis is required before approval? How will these approved changes be documented and communicated? How will baselines or project documents be updated afterwards? These questions help the project respond to change with discipline and visibility. So this week we should view change management as a governance tool. The change management artifact is a governance tool. It helps protect project alignment by ensuring the adjustments are evaluated intentionally rather than absorbed informally. Effective change control allows needed changes without losing project discipline. So it's important to distinguish between change as a reality of project work and change control as the method used to govern that reality. Change will happen in most projects. I'm going to say change will happen in all projects because they kind of exist in a lake of change. New information emerges, stakeholder needs evolve, issues surface, and conditions shift. Change control exists so the project can respond to those adjustments without losing alignment, accountability, or performance discipline. This is why change control should not be misunderstood as a system for blocking all change. A well-run project doesn't try to freeze reality. Instead, it creates a process for determining which changes are justified, what impacts they may create, and who must approve them, and how approved changes will be incorporated into the project. So there's a kind of a thought is that we don't want to discourage change, but we want to encourage the correct change. That is kind of the idea. And that discipline matters because informal change can damage the project quickly. Scope may expand without schedule relief, costs may rise without corresponding approval, teams may begin working on revised expectations that were never properly communicated, and stakeholders may assume a decision was made when it was only discussed. And change control helps prevent that kind of drift in the project. A useful way to think about change control is that it protects the integrity of the project's baselines and it protects the integrity of the project's baseline and commitments while still allowing the project to adapt when adaptation is warranted. It strengthens visibility because decisions are documented. It improves accountability because authority is clarified, and it improves decision quality because impacts are considered before action is taken. So the real purpose of change control is balanced governance and helps the project remain flexible enough to respond and disciplined enough to remain manageable. Projects stay more controllable when teams distinguish issues, risk, and changes clearly. One common source of project confusion is treating issues, risk, and changes as if they all mean the same thing. They're related, but they're not identical. A good project control depends on keeping those distinctions clear. A risk is a possible future event or condition that could affect the project. It hasn't happened yet. It may happen. So the team identifies it, analyzes it, and plans on how to respond if needed. Risk planning is about preparing for uncertainty before it becomes disruption. An issue is different because it already exists. It's a current problem, condition, or obstacle that requires attention now. An issue may involve a missed deadline, a resource conflict, a quality problem, or a vendor delay. Because the issue is already affecting the project, the response is no longer just planning, it's active management and resolution. In other words, there's no uncertainty in an issue. It's certain because it's happening. And a risk event can become an issue when that uncertainty, when the trigger requires action. Change management is also different. A change is a proposed adjustment to some part of the approved project approach. Baseline, requirement, deliverable, schedule, budget, or method of work. A change may be requested because of an issue, or because of a realized risk, or because stakeholders want to alter the project direction or expectations. These three concepts are connected. A risk may materialize and become an issue. An issue may require a change request to resolve it. A proposed change may introduce new risk, but even though they may interact, the management response should not be identical in every case. And this distinction is important because projects become more controllable when ownership, escalation, reporting, and decision paths are based on the right category. A team that confuses issues, risk, and changes is more likely to respond inconsistently or too late when these things happen. Projects respond more effectively when escalation and decision paths are defined before problems emerge. So once a project begins dealing with real execution pressures, the value of a clear decision path becomes apparent. Teams need to know what to do when something happens, who needs to be informed, when escalation is required, and what kind of response process should be used. This is where project controls become practical. If the team identifies a possible future threat that may belong in the risk process, if a current problem is already affecting delivery, it may need to be logged as a management issue. If a proposed adjustment would affect scope, schedule, cost, quality, or another approved expectations, it may need to go through formal change review. A decision path helps the team make those distinctions quickly and respond appropriately. So without this structure, teams often lose time trying to decide whether something is serious enough to escalate, who owns the next step, or whether a conversation has become approval. That uncertainty can delay a response. It can create inconsistent handling and reduce leadership confidence in the project's control environment. A good decision path doesn't need to be overly complex. In many projects, it can be as simple as identifying the condition, determining whether it's a risk, issue, or a change, assessing its impact and urgency, assigning ownership, and following the appropriate reporting, escalation, and approval route. That what matters is that the logic is visible and understood before the project is under execution pressure. Project control should match how work is planned, reviewed, and adjusted. Just as governance should fit the project's delivery approach, project control should fit it as well. The way a project communicates, reviews quality, manages risk, and handles changes should reflect how the work is actually being planned and delivered. In a predictive environment or project, controls are often more baseline centered. Scope, schedule, and cost are typically defined in greater detail. So control mechanisms focus more heavily on variance, visibility, formal reporting, milestone review, and structured change approval. That kind of control environment supports project where predictability and conformance are important. In an adaptive project, controls still matter, but they operate through a different rhythm or different cadence. Work is reviewed in shorter cycles. Stakeholder feedback occurs more frequently, and priorities may evolve as learning occurs, learning about the product occurs. And in that environment, control depends less on preserving a fixed detailed plan and more on maintaining transparency, discipline prioritization, and frequent review and timely adjustment. Hybrid projects combine both patterns. Some parts of the project may need a formal baseline control, while others benefit from iterative refinement. And in those cases, the project manager needs to design control mechanisms that preserve accountability without creating conflict between structured and adaptive parts of the work. So again, this is a project management skill that you need to develop. Step 5, and we're going to talk about the project assignment here. Week 6 applies project controls directly to the course project, step 5. Step 5 requires translation of project control concepts into management artifacts. But week 6 is highly applied because the topics we've been talking about connect directly to this part of the project. And at this point, the course project is no longer identifying the project and building foundational planning artifacts. We're now creating control documentation that helps the project function in a more governable and execution-ready way. So the assignment asks you to develop 4 specific artifacts: so communications management plan or statement, a quality management plan or statement, a risk management plan or statement, and a change management plan or statement. And to just to distinguish between the plan and the plan would be much more detailed. A statement is more of a general overall statement. Either one's acceptable. If you've got a complex project, you're probably going to something that looks more like a plan. If it's not so complex, you may something that's a real high level planning statement. But these documents show how the project will communicate, maintain standards, address uncertainty, and govern adjustments as the work progresses. This is why this step of the course project is more than a documentation. It asks you to demonstrate that you understand control, support, oversight, and discipline management. Your artifact should not read like disconnected templates. They should show a coherent logic for how the project will be managed once execution pressures begin to emerge. And it's also important to remember that the submission should demonstrate substantial work. And it's not heavy, complicated. And again, this is a simulation, so I'm not looking for heavy bureaucratic stuff, but it should be sufficient enough, it's substantial enough to show that you understand what governance is all about. So a useful way to think about this step is that you're taking control concepts from the lecture here and from the reading and converting them into a practical project management documentation that could actually guide a real project if necessary. The submission, step 5 submission show how project controls should actually guide the project. And I think I've talked about this. This may be a little bit of overlap here. But as you complete step 5, one of the most important things to remember is that submission does more than just fill the 4 templates. It demonstrates control logic. In other words, the document would show how the project would actually be managed. And so that goes back to what I was just saying. Once the work's underway, that means that communications, quality, risk, and change artifacts should fit the project itself. They should reflect the size, complexity, stakeholders, and delivery approach of the project rather than sounding generic or disconnected from the project context. A good submission will explain how communication will occur, how quality will review, how risk will be handled, and how changes will be evaluated in ways that make sense for your project. So it's also important that the artifacts align with one another. The communication plans should support escalation and reporting needs that make sense alongside the risk and change plan. The quality plan should reinforce the standards and acceptance expectations already established elsewhere in the project. And risk and change plans should show clear ownership and review logic and decision structure. So when the documents all work together, it looks more like a real project control package and less than isolated coursework. So the goal here is not just to submit the required forms, it's to show that a usable control structure could guide execution of your project with discipline and visibility. So looking ahead, week 7 finalizes the project plan for approval and execution readiness. Week 7 brings the project plan together for final review and alignment and approval. Week 7 serves as a point where the major planning and control artifacts developed so far are brought together into a more complete and integrated project plan. So up to this point, we've been building the project in parts: initiation and approval, scope, or identification, initiation, approval, scope, schedule, budget, and now project controls. And in week 7, the focus is going to shift towards the final integration, alignment, and approval readiness. This part is important because the project plan is not just a collection of separate documents. It needs to function as a coherent management framework. The scope artifacts, the schedule artifacts, the budget artifacts, and the control artifacts should reinforce one another and present a believable picture of how the project will be carried out and governed. And so this also connects directly to governance, because approval is not just about whether the documents exist, it's about whether the plan demonstrates enough clarity, consistency, and control for the project to move forward with confidence. So a project may have all the artifacts, and those artifacts may conflict with one, but those artifacts may conflict with one another or leave gaps in decision logic, communication structure, or quality expectation, or risk response. So we want to make sure that everything is consistent. So essentially in week 7, what we're doing is we're taking all the work we've done so far and going in and making any adjustments. Like some of the feedback I've given may recommend that you make an adjustment, or adjustments that you've found that you need to make as you go through this. In a real world, you're going to be updating these project planning documents. You'll be updating your scope plan as you're working on the schedule when things don't work out, or when you're doing procurement. And so we want to make those adjustments and then put it all together and submit it to your sponsor, which is me, for the course project, for approval. So essentially week 7, next week, you can bring everything together and submit it as you would. And the idea of this is to simulate where the project team formalizes its plan, and now they're wanting approval to move forward into execution. And you can submit that, and we'll talk more about it next week, but it often confuses students. You can submit this in individual, like a zip file with individual files. You can put it all into one big, PDF or Word document. That works. I know some people have Excel spreadsheets as well as project document files. That works too. Just so that, you may want, one of the things you'll have to submit on this is sort of a introduction to the executive summary, if you will, of the plan. And it just I need to be able to see that executive summary and show that you thought through how all these deliverables. So that's week 7, and we'll talk about it some more next week. Week 7 will probably be a quick night for the class as well. So project controls, as we finish up here, project controls help projects stay Stay governable as execution begins. The project controls helps us stay aligned, visible, and manageable as execution begins. So as we close, the main takeaway is that project controls are what makes governance practical. Governance designs the structure for oversight, authority, and decision-making, but project controls are what make the structure usable once the project begins facing real execution conditions. This is why communications planning helps ensure that information flows to the right people the right way. Quality planning helps define how standards and acceptance expectations will be protected. Risk planning helps team prepare for uncertainty before it becomes disruption. Change planning helps the project adjust in a controlled and accountable manner when conditions shift. And together, all these artifacts help the project remain aligned, visible, and manageable. They support escalation, improve decision quality, reduce the likelihood that the project will drift into informal or inconsistent management. They also reinforce the broader idea that project control is not just about monitoring performance after the fact. It's about establishing management logic that helps the project respond well as execution begins. So the deeper message this week is that good project planning is not complete until the project can also be governed, monitored, and adjusted with discipline. And that's what project controls make possible. And that's what we're building in project step 5. And that's the end. Again, I just want to commend you for being here. There's 1,000 other things you could do. And it's not lost on me that you're here, and your engagement with all these concepts will help. It shows a good commitment to, a serious commitment to your education and your project management leadership. Y'all have a good week, and I'm looking forward to seeing your week 5 work, and I'll talk to you later.